At my daughter's 8th birthday, my brother shoved her face into her cake and laughed. My father watched. But what he did 3 seconds later silenced the whole room and set in motion the reckoning our family never saw coming. Before we get back to today's story, I have some exciting news to share. We have officially launched a brand new channel called Tales Beneath Skin. Over there, we are dedicating our platform to bringing you the juiciest, most jaw-dropping Reddit drama stories on the internet. We're diving deep into wild family feuds, shocking relationship betrayals, and epic tales of petty revenge. But we don't just leave you hanging with a cliffhanger. We track down every single update, plot twist, and final resolution so you get the complete, satisfying story from start to finish. Grab your popcorn because we are serving all the tea with full context, community reactions, and top-tier narration that brings the chaos to life. Make sure to subscribe to Tales Beneath Skin right now so you don't miss out. You'll find the link in the video description, the pinned comment, and the collaboration tag. Thank you for your continued support as we grow this community. Now, back to the story. I had spent 11 days on that cake. Most people wouldn't understand that. To them, a birthday cake is a thing you pick up from the grocery store the morning of, still cold from the case, with a name piped in blue gel by a stranger. But I own a bakery. I have spent 17 years learning how to make sugar behave, how to coax buttercream into looking like fabric, how to build something tall and improbable that holds its shape under its own weight. And for my daughter's 8th birthday, I made her the only thing she had asked for since March. A castle. 3 tiers, pale lavender, with hand-piped ivy climbing the turrets, and a little fondant Emma standing at the top of the highest tower in a green dress, because green was her favorite color that year. I had stayed up until 2 in the morning 3 nights running. I had burned my wrist on the oven rack and not even stopped to run it under water. I had turned away 2 paying orders that week so I would have the counter space and the time. None of that felt like sacrifice. It felt like the most obvious thing in the world because I would have done anything for that child, and the cake was just a shape I could pour it into. The party was at my father's house. That was Grant's idea, relayed through my father the way Grant's ideas always were. Your brother thinks it'd be nice to have it at the house, more room for the kids, the yard. As if my apartment weren't good enough. As if I hadn't hosted Emma's last 3 birthdays just fine in a space that was mine. But I said yes, because saying yes to keep the peace was a reflex I had been practicing my entire life. The way some people crack their knuckles without noticing. So there I was in my father's dining room with 16 children and a dozen adults, and my castle in the center of the table catching the afternoon light through the window. Emma had gasped when she saw it. Actually gasped, both hands over her mouth, and then she had run at me and buried her face in my apron and said, "Mommy, it's the best one you ever made." And I thought right then that whatever else was wrong in my life, the divorce that had hollowed me out, the loans I was still paying down, the exhaustion that lived permanently behind my eyes, right then, none of it mattered. My daughter was happy. I had made her happy. We sang. Emma's face glowed above the 8 candles, orange light dancing on her cheeks, and she squeezed her eyes shut to make a wish. I had my phone up, filming because I film everything now, ever since I missed her first steps working a double shift and swore I'd never miss another moment. So I was recording when it happened. I have it, every frame. Grant was standing behind her, my brother. 44 years old in a golf shirt, with the easy grin he wears the way other men wear cologne. And as Emma leaned in to blow out her candles, Grant put his big hand flat on the back of her head and pushed. I heard the sound before my brain caught up to the picture. A wet, heavy sound. My castle collapsing sideways. Lavender buttercream and cake and 11 days smeared across my daughter's face and up into her hair and her open, shocked eyes. And Grant laughed. He threw his head back and laughed like it was the funniest thing he'd seen all year, and he said, loud for the room, "Aw, come on, it's tradition. Lighten up, everybody. Kids gonna remember this forever." Emma came up screaming. Not crying, screaming, that raw animal sound children make when the world has done something they didn't know it was allowed to do. Frosting in her eyes, cake in her nose. And 16 children stared, and a dozen adults froze, and I dropped my phone on the table and it kept recording the ceiling. I want you to understand something about that moment. I have replayed it 1,000 times. It wasn't the cake. I could make another cake in my sleep. It was the way he did it. The casual, entitled certainty that he could take my child's joy and my work and grind them into the tablecloth, and everyone would just laugh along, because that is what everyone had always done for Grant, our whole lives. I was already moving toward my daughter when my father stood up. And here is the thing I have never been able to explain to anyone who wasn't in that room. It wasn't the ruined cake that changed everything that day. It was the 3 seconds of silence after my father got out of his chair. I got to Emma first. Of course I did. I scooped her up off the floor and pressed a napkin to her eyes, whispering the nonsense words you whisper. Okay, 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 I've got you, baby, while she shuddered against me and smeared frosting into my shirt. I carried her to the bathroom down the hall, and I ran the tap warm, and I cleaned her face while she hiccuped, and I did not let her see my own face in the mirror, because my face was doing something I didn't want an 8-year-old to witness. Behind me, through the door I'd left cracked, I could hear the party dissolving. The high, false brightness of adults trying to reassemble a moment that couldn't be reassembled. Somebody put on music. Somebody suggested the kids go out to the yard. And under all of it, Grant's voice, still light, still amused, doing the thing he does, turning himself into the reasonable one. She's being dramatic. Diana's always been sensitive. It's frosting, for God's sake. Diana's always been sensitive. There it was, 40 years old and still in perfect working order, the little machine my family had built to explain away everything Grant did. If he broke it, I was too attached. If he took it, I was selfish for missing it. If he hurt me, I was too thin-skinned. The frame was so old and so familiar that half the room probably nodded along without even hearing it. When Emma was clean and calm, wrapped in one of my father's old flannel shirts because her party dress was ruined, I brought her back out. I planned to gather her presents, thank the few parents worth thanking, and go home. That was my entire plan. Retreat, absorb, smooth it over. It's what I did. It's what I'd always done. My father was waiting in the hall. Walter Holloway is 68 years old, a retired shop teacher with hands like tree roots and a way of speaking so slowly you sometimes forget he's building toward something. He had never once, in my whole life, chosen me over Grant. Not when Grant crashed the car I'd saved 2 years to buy. Not when Grant borrowed the money my mother left me and never gave it back. My father's love was a river that ran in one direction, and I had made a kind of peace with standing on the dry bank. So I braced for it. I braced for Diana, don't make a scene. Diana, your brother didn't mean anything. Diana, think of the guests. Instead, my father looked at Emma, at her red eyes, at the flannel shirt swallowing her small frame, and something moved across his face that I had never seen there before. He crouched down, knees cracking to her level. Emma, he said, that was a beautiful cake your mother made you. I'm sorry it got wrecked. That wasn't right, and it wasn't funny, and I'm sorry. I could not have been more stunned if the floor had opened up. That was the 3 seconds of silence I mentioned, because Grant had heard it too. Grant had come out into the hall behind our father, still holding a beer, and when Dad apologized to my daughter, apologized out loud, and called Grant's little joke not right, Grant's grin didn't so much fall as curdle. For one instant, before he pasted it back on, I saw the real thing underneath. And it wasn't hurt. It wasn't even anger exactly. It was calculation. Fast and cold like a man doing sums. Dad, Grant said, and his voice had a new edge under the lightness, a warning wire pulled tight. Don't do that. Don't make this into a whole thing. You know how they get. My father straightened up slowly. He looked at Grant for a long moment. And then he said something quiet that I didn't fully understand at the time, but that would come back to me again and again in the weeks that followed. He said, I've been letting you make things into whatever you want for a long time, son. I'm tired. We left 10 minutes later. In the car, buckling Emma into her seat, I noticed my hands were shaking. And unbidden, my mother's voice came into my head. My mother, dead 9 years now, who had taught me everything I know about baking before the cancer took her. She used to say it whenever I got frustrated that a cake looked wrong when I cut into it, when the outside was flawless but the inside had a sunken seam or a hollow gap. "A cake can look perfect on top and still be hollow underneath," she'd say, wiping flour on her apron. "You never really know a cake until you cut it." I don't know why it surfaced right then in that parking spot with frosting still under my fingernails. But it did, and it wouldn't leave. Because for the first time in my life, my father had picked up the knife. To understand why my father's apology landed like a thunderclap, you have to understand the arithmetic of our childhood. Grant was the firstborn, the son, the golden one. It wasn't subtle. Grant got the new bike, I got Grant's old one, repainted. Grant's BS were he's just bored, he's too smart for that class. My as were, well, of course, you always were the studious one, said in a tone that made studious sound like a consolation prize. When Grant quit college in his second year, my father drove 4 hours to help him move his things home and set him up in an apartment. When I got into a good state school on a partial scholarship, my father said he couldn't help with the rest. Money was tight, and I worked 40 hours a week through all 4 years and graduated with debt that took me a decade to clear. I don't tell you this for pity. I tell you so you'll understand what I did with all of it. I turned it into fuel. I opened my bakery at 31 with a loan I signed alone. I built it into something real. A name people in town knew, wedding cakes booked 8 months out, a little glass case that made children press their noses to it. I did it while married to a man who left when Emma was 2, and I did it while a single mother, and I did it without once asking my father for a cent, because I had learned early that the answer would be a soft, apologetic no, followed by the sound of him writing Grant another check. And through all of it, I told myself the favoritism was just habit, old-fashioned, harmless. My father wasn't a cruel man. He was a weak one, and there is a difference, and I had spent 40 years excusing the weakness because the cruelty seemed to belong to someone else. Grant, let me tell you about my brother. Grant has never held a job longer than 3 years. He is charming in the specific way that costs him nothing and costs everyone around him a great deal. He consults. He has ventures. Every 18 months or so, there is a new opportunity, a can't-miss thing, and every 18 months or so it quietly vanishes and is never mentioned again. And the through line, the constant, the thing that has funded Grant's entire adult life, is my father's wallet. But it was more than money, and this is the part I didn't see clearly until later. Over the last 4 or 5 years, since Mom died and Dad's health started its slow decline, a bad hip, then the diabetes, then the fall that scared everyone, Grant had moved closer. Physically closer. He'd taken an apartment 15 minutes from Dad's house. And he had, so smoothly that none of us clocked it, made himself the gate. You wanted to visit Dad. Check with Grant first, Dad tires easily. Dad wanted to come to Emma's school play. He's not up for it, I'll tell him you asked. The doctor's appointments, the paperwork, the phone that stopped getting answered when I called and only rang through when Grant was there to hand it over. I had thought Grant was being helpful. That's the terrible thing. I had actually felt guilty, running my business, raising my daughter, unable to be there as much as Grant was. I had thought my brother, for once, was stepping up. 2 things happened in the week after the party that turned that guilt inside out. The first was small. My father called me. On his own phone, in the middle of a weekday afternoon, a thing that I realized with a jolt had not happened in over a year. His voice was thin and a little scared. "Diana," he said, "did you cash the check I sent for Emma's birthday?" I hadn't gotten a check. I told him so. There was a long silence on the line. "I gave it to Grant to give you," he said. $300. He said he'd pass it along at the party. Another silence. He said he did. "He didn't, Dad," I said gently. "It's fine, it doesn't matter." But I heard him breathing, and I heard the gears in an old man's mind starting, for the first time, to grind against something they'd been sliding smoothly over for years. The second thing happened at the bakery, and it was not small at all. Grant came in. He almost never came to my shop, too far beneath him, I think, a place that smelled of flour and hard work. But that Thursday he came in near closing, and he waited until Marisol had gone to the back, and he leaned on my counter with that grin, and he dropped every pretense of the loving uncle. "You need to walk it back," he said quietly. "Whatever you said to Dad, he's confused, he's calling people, asking questions. You're upsetting him." He tilted his head, and the grin thinned to nothing. "He's not well, Diana. His judgment's not what it was. Somebody's got to protect him from getting worked up. I've been handling things for a reason." He tapped the counter twice, slow. "Don't make me handle you too." Then the grin snapped back on, wide and warm, and he said, loud enough for Marisol to hear as she came back out, "Great talk, sis. Love the new sign out front." And he walked out into the evening, whistling. I stood there with my hands flat on the cold glass of the display case, and my mother's voice was in my ear again. "You never really know a cake until you cut it." Well, my father had made the first cut at Emma's party. And what I could see in the sliver of the opening was that the inside of this family was not what any of us had been told. It was hollow in places, and it was rotten in one. I picked up my phone, and instead of walking it back, I opened a new note, and I titled it with the date, and I started to write down everything I could remember. Every check. Every "Dad's too tired." Every strange gap in a story that had never quite added up, because I run a business. And the one thing 17 years of running a business had taught me, better than anyone in my family knew, was how to follow the money. I want to describe the exact moment I stopped being a victim, because I remember it precisely, and because I think it matters. It was the following morning, 4:40 a.m., in the dark of my kitchen before Emma woke. I was proofing dough by habit, hands moving on their own, and I was crying a little, the quiet leaking kind of crying that doesn't stop you from working. I was crying because of the thing Grant had said. "Don't make me handle you too." I was crying because it had worked. I could feel the old reflex rising, the one that said smooth it over, keep the peace, don't be sensitive. And I stood there with my hands in the dough and I thought, he is counting on that. He has always counted on that. My entire life, Grant's whole strategy has been that I will fold, because I always fold, and that the family will call my folding grace and his taking confidence, and everyone will go back to their afternoons. And I thought about my father's voice on the phone. He said he did. $300 gone, a small theft, a rehearsal-sized theft. And I thought, if he'll pocket $300 meant for a child in front of witnesses at a birthday party, what is he doing when no one is looking? When the only witness is a confused old man whose phone he answers. I stopped crying. I washed the dough off my hands. And I made a decision that I did not fully understand the size of yet. I was going to find out. Here is what Grant did not know about me. He thought of me as the baker, the sensitive one, the sister who was good with her hands and bad at standing up for herself. What he had never once bothered to notice was that I do not just make cakes. I run a business with employees, payroll, vendor contracts, a line of credit, quarterly taxes, and margins thin enough to shave with. I read financial statements for a living. I have spent 17 years learning to spot the exact place where numbers stop telling the truth, the padded invoice, the vendor who overcharges, the month where the deposits and the sales don't reconcile, and something has walked out the back door. I am, without ever having used the word about myself, a forensic reader of money. And Grant, who had spent his life underestimating me, had left a paper trail through the accounts of a father whose finances he'd assumed no one would ever check. I couldn't check them myself. Not legally, not yet, but I knew someone who could open the door. I called Marisol. Marisol has worked beside me for 9 years. She is my closest friend, and before she came to work at the bakery, she spent 11 years as a paralegal at an elder law firm. I had forgotten that, honestly, until I needed it. I sat her down in the back after we closed and I told her everything, the check, the gatekeeping, the threat, the years of it. And Marisol, who is not a dramatic woman, went very still and then said, "Diana, if he's the one handling your father's money and your father's calls, and your father is starting to notice things go missing, you cannot go at this like a family fight. You go at it like a case. Documents, dates. A power of attorney, if he's got one, find out if he's got one. And you need to get your dad in a room, alone, without Grant, and you need to do it soon." That word, alone, was the whole problem, wasn't it? Grant was the gate. So my first job was to get around the gate. It turned out to be almost embarrassingly simple, and it broke my heart. I called my father on a Tuesday morning when I knew, from years of half attention, that Grant had a standing racquetball game. My father answered his own phone. I asked if I could bring Emma by to see him. He said yes so fast, so hungrily, that I understood in one gutting instant how lonely he had been, how long it had been since anyone came who wasn't Grant. We went. Emma showed him a drawing. And while she colored at the kitchen table, I sat with my father and I did not ambush him. I just talked. And slowly, gently, I asked questions about his bank, about his bills, about who paid them now. And my father, who had spent 40 years being managed by his son, began to tell me things in the halting way of a man who has been vaguely uneasy for a long time and never let himself say so out loud. Grant had power of attorney. Financial. Signed 2 years ago, in case something happened, at an appointment my father only dimly remembered, with a lawyer he'd never met before or since. Grant paid the bills now. Grant had reorganized some things with the savings. For tax reasons, Grant had said, my father did not know his own account balances. He had not seen a statement in over a year because the statements went to Grant's address now. It's easier, my father said, and then he looked at me, and his old face folded and he said, isn't it? He said it was easier. I took my father's hand. It was the first time I could remember touching him since my mother's funeral. Dad, I said, I'd like to help you look at some of it. Just look. Would that be all right? He held on to my hand like a man in deep water. Your mother always did the books, he whispered. After she passed, I couldn't. Grant said he'd take care of it, so I let him. His eyes came up to mine, wet and frightened, and underneath it, ashamed. What did I let him take care of, Diana? I didn't have the answer yet. But within a week, with Marisol beside me and my father's own signature authorizing the request, I would. The statements arrived in a fat envelope, forwarded from the bank once my father formally requested his own records. Records Grant had quietly rerouted, but which, it turned out, an account holder can always reclaim. I spread 18 months of them across my dining table after Emma was asleep, and I did what I do. I followed the money. It did not take long. It never takes long once you know how to look. The pattern was almost lazy. Grant had assumed no one would ever check, and so he hadn't even been careful. There were withdrawals, regular ones, 400 here, 800 there, sometimes 1,500, labeled with the kind of vague notes a man writes for an audience of no one. Repairs, medical, assistance. I cross-referenced. There were no repairs. The house was visibly falling apart. The medical withdrawals didn't match a single one of my father's actual copays, which I could see, separately, going out on their own. And then there was the big one. 14 months ago, my father's largest savings account, the one my mother had built over 30 years, nearly $90,000, money meant to keep him comfortable and cared for until the end of his life, had been drained down to under $4,000 in a series of transfers to an account I didn't recognize. I recognized it eventually. It took Marisol 2 phone calls. It was an LLC, Holloway Consulting Group, Grant's latest venture, the one he'd never quite explained. My father's retirement had become my brother's slush fund, dressed up as a business, and my father had signed it away without ever understanding what the papers meant. I sat at that table until 3 in the morning, and I did not cry this time. I built a spreadsheet. Every transfer, every date, every fabricated label matched against reality, and at the top of it, I typed a total. What Grant had taken from our father that I could prove on paper came to just over $140,000. The confrontation was not planned as a confrontation. That's important. I did not go looking to fight Grant. I went to my father's house on a Sunday with Emma, and Grant happened to be there, and I made a mistake. I let my father see the folder. I'd brought it to show him, gently, privately, later when Grant was gone. But Grant saw me hand my father a single sheet at the kitchen table, the summary page, and he crossed the room in 3 strides and snatched it out of the old man's hands. He read it. I watched him read it. And I watched the golden child's face do, in the open, the thing I'd only glimpsed for an instant in the hallway. Where did you get this? His voice was very quiet. From Dad's bank, I said, with Dad's permission. It's his money, Grant. It was his to look at. And then Grant did what Grant does, and it was a masterclass, and it told the whole room everything. He did not deny it. That was the tell. A man who'd done nothing would have said, "This is insane. Explain yourself." Grant instead went straight to the story, the frame, the machine, 40 years old and ready. "You have no idea what you're looking at," he said, warm and pitying, turning to include our father, turning me into the crazy one in real time. "Dad, this is what I was afraid of. She's confused herself. Those are business expenses, things I paid for you, Dad, that I fronted and reimbursed myself for. She doesn't understand how any of this works because she's never managed anything bigger than a bake sale." Never managed anything bigger than a bake sale. I almost laughed. "Then it'll be easy to show the receipts," I said. "For $140,000, Grant, show us the receipts. Show us what Holloway Consulting Group did for Dad. I'll wait." And there it was, the flicker. Grant's mouth opened and closed. And then, because he had no receipts and no answer, he did the last thing in the playbook. He got loud. He slammed his hand on the table so hard the sugar bowl jumped, and he shouted that I was a jealous, bitter, failed little woman who'd always resented him, that I was trying to poison Dad against him, that I wanted the money for myself, that this was exactly like me. He stood over me and he shouted, and Emma started to cry in the doorway, and I thought, good. Let Dad see it. Because through all of it, my father sat very still at the head of the table, holding the single sheet of paper Grant had thrown back down. And my father was not looking at me, and he was not looking at Grant. He was looking at the total. And his lips were moving slowly, reading the number over and over, the number that used to be his and my mother's whole life. Grant did not go quietly after that Sunday. Cornered men rarely do. Within 2 days, the calls started. To me, which I let go to voicemail and saved, everyone, some of them wheedling, some of them threatening, all of them useful. But worse, the calls started to Dad. Grant had lost his exclusive gate, but he still had the key of a lifetime's practice, and he used it. He was at the house constantly now, I learned, more than ever, working the old man the way he'd always worked him. Diana's exaggerating. Diana always twists things. You know how she gets. Do you really want to drag your own son through the mud, Dad, over an accounting mix-up? Do you want to be the father who put his boy in jail? And it was working. My father, who had glimpsed the truth, began to slide back toward the comfortable lie, because the lie was so much less painful than the truth that he had signed his life savings over to a son who'd robbed him. I could hear it when I called, the uncertainty creeping back into his voice. "Grant says the accountant will clear it all up. Grant says you're just upset about the party still. Maybe we shouldn't, maybe it's not our business to. He is my son, Diana." I understood. I want to be fair, even now. It is a terrible thing to make a parent choose to see that their child is a thief. My father wasn't defending Grant because he was stupid or cruel. He was defending him because the alternative was a grief no 68-year-old man wants to carry. Grant was betting everything on that grief. He was betting that Dad would rather be robbed than heartbroken. I needed something Grant couldn't talk his way around. A spreadsheet he could reframe. My word he could poison. I needed a witness who wasn't family, who had no dog in our fight, who could stand up and say, "He did it to me too." Marisol found her. The LLC filings for Holloway Consulting Group listed a second name from 3 years back, a former partner who'd since been scrubbed from everything. Renata Vasquez. It took some doing, Marisol's old paralegal instincts, a couple of dead ends, a message sent through a professional networking site with the subject line, "This is about Grant Holloway, and I think you'll want to talk to me." Renata called within the hour. I met her at a coffee shop halfway between our towns. She was a sharp, tired woman in her 50s who ran a real business, a legitimate consulting firm, and who had made the mistake, 3 years earlier, of going into a side venture with a charming man named Grant Holloway who told her he had capital to invest. She had put in $60,000. Grant had put in nothing, or rather, she now suspected, he had put in money that wasn't his. The venture failed. Her $60,000 vanished. And when she'd pushed, when she'd threatened lawyers, Grant had produced just enough fog and just enough paperwork and just enough charm to make suing him look like more money thrown after bad. So she'd walked away, ashamed like victims are, silent like he'd counted on. He's very good, she told me, both hands around her coffee. That's the thing people don't understand. He's not a thug. He's a believable man. He makes you feel like the crazy one for doubting him. She looked at me. You said your father, how much? 140, I said. Renata closed her eyes. His retirement. His and my mother's. She was quiet a long moment. Then she reached into her bag and pulled out a folder of her own, emails, wire records, the ghost of Holloway Consulting Group's earlier life, and she slid it across the table. I've been sitting on this for 3 years feeling stupid, she said. If it helps you nail him, it's yours, and I'll say it out loud. To anyone, I'm done being quiet about that man. The second confrontation was not loud. It was the opposite of loud, and that's why it worked. I did not corner Grant. I asked Marisol, who had by then quietly engaged an elder law attorney on my father's behalf, to arrange a simple meeting. My father, his new attorney, myself, and Grant in the attorney's office, ostensibly to review the accounts and clear everything up, which was the one invitation Grant couldn't refuse without confirming guilt. He came in that day still confident, still golden, ready to fog the room. And the attorney, a calm woman with reading glasses, laid it out. My spreadsheet. The bank's own records, and then, the thing Grant had no idea was coming, Renata's folder, wire transfers. The pattern, repeated, dated, corroborated by a stranger. A second victim. The attorney read it out flatly, without drama, and asked Grant to account for the transfers. And Grant opened his mouth to begin the story, the frame, the she's confused. And my father, who had been silent the whole time, said one word. Stop. Grant stopped. My father was looking at the papers, and then he was looking at his son, and his face was doing the thing I had waited 40 years to see. It was not anger. It was recognition. The old man had finally cut into the cake, all the way to the center, and he had seen what was there. I signed it, my father said, very quietly to Grant. Didn't I? Whatever you put in front of me, I signed it, because you're my boy and I trusted you. His voice cracked. You let me trust you. You let me sit there for 2 years, thinking my son was taking care of me. Grant reached for him. Dad. That was your mother's money, my father said, and that was the end of the spell. There was no shouting match. I had braced for one, some part of me even wanted one, the public reckoning, the raised voices, the vindication you can hear from across a room. But that isn't how it ended, and I have come to understand that the quiet way was worse for Grant than any scene could have been. Because a scene, Grant could survive. A scene, he could reframe on the drive home into another story about his hysterical sister. What happened in that office was something he couldn't talk his way out of, because for once the only audience that mattered wasn't buying. The attorney, her name was MS. Ackhafer let the silence sit. She was good at that. She waited until my father had finished, until his last words hung fully in the air, and then she spoke in the same flat, procedural voice she'd used the whole time, and somehow that flatness was the most devastating thing in the room. Mr. Holloway, she said, meaning Grant, I'll be direct so there's no confusion. On the record in front of us, there are transfers totaling approximately $141,000 from your father's accounts to an entity you control. We have a second party. She touched Renata's folder, prepared to testify to a materially identical pattern involving her own funds. Your father has today revoked your power of attorney. She slid a document across the desk. This is effective as of this morning. He's also asked me to prepare a demand for a full accounting and restitution. I want you to understand what that means. If you cannot produce legitimate documentation for these transfers, and I don't believe you can, your father has every basis to pursue both civil recovery and a criminal referral for financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult. That's not a threat. It's the state of the file. Grant looked at me then, and I want to tell you what was in his face, because it's the thing I'll remember longest. He looked at me the way a man looks at a locked door he's always assumed would open for him. All my life, I had been the sister who folded. He had walked into that office certain that if he pushed hard enough, charmed well enough, shouted long enough, I would fold again, because that was the arrangement, that was the family, that was the machine. And he saw, sitting across from him with a spreadsheet I had built at 3 in the morning and a witness I had found and a father I had finally reached, that the arrangement was over. That I was not going to fold. That there was, at last, nothing left of me to push. "Diana," he said, and his voice had gone soft and awful, reaching for the old lever. "You'd really do this, to your own brother, over money." And here is where I said the thing I had been carrying since my kitchen at 4:40 in the morning. I didn't say it loud. I said it the way you say the truest things. "It was never about the money, Grant." I looked at him. "You put your hand on my daughter's head and shoved her face into a cake I spent 11 days making, and you laughed, and you told a room full of people she'd remember it forever. You were right. She will. And so will I." That's when I finally cut into all of it, and saw what we've all been eating around for 40 years. I felt my mother very close to me right then. "You didn't get caught because I got angry. You got caught because for the first time in your life, somebody actually looked." Grant turned to our father one last time. The old lever, the last one, the one that had never failed him. "Dad, you're not going to let her do this to me. I'm your son." My father was crying. Openly, the way old men cry, without hiding it. But he did not reach for Grant, and he did not take it back. He said, "You are my son, and I loved you so much I let you rob me blind and called it love, and I think," his breath hitched, "I think I did that to your sister for 40 years too, just backwards. I let you take from her and called her selfish for minding." He looked at me, and the look was an apology bigger than any words he had. Then back to Grant. "You're going to pay it back, son, every dollar you can. And then you and I are going to have to figure out what's left between us, if anything is. But you don't answer my phone anymore. You don't sign my name anymore. You're done." Grant stood up. For a moment the golden child, the charmer, the whole 40-year performance flickered, and then it just went out like a bulb, and what was left standing in that office was an ordinary middle-aged man who had spent his life taking and had finally, in a quiet room, run out of people willing to give. He left without another word. The door clicked shut behind him, and it was the softest, most final sound I have ever heard. I won't pretend it wrapped up neatly or fast or without cost. Real life doesn't cut as clean as a cake. The money was mostly gone, that's the truth. Grant had spent the bulk of it on the life he wore like a golf shirt, but not all of it was lost. MS. Ackhafer was very good, and Grant, faced with a documented pattern, a second complaining witness in Renata, and a criminal referral that the county's financial exploitation unit took seriously, chose the thing men like Grant always eventually choose: the deal that keeps them out of a cell. He signed a confessed judgment for the full amount and a restitution schedule with real teeth. He lost the apartment 15 minutes from Dad's house. Holloway Consulting Group dissolved, and with it the fiction that Grant had ever been anything but a man living on other people's savings. Renata, freed by our case, filed her own civil claim and recovered a portion of her $60,000. Word got around, the way it does in a town where everyone knows everyone. Not through any campaign of mine, I never had to lift a finger, and the doors that had always swung open for charming Grant Holloway began, one by one, to stay shut. The golden child discovered what the rest of us had always known, that the shine had never been his. It had been our father's money, catching the light. My father is another kind of resolution, and a harder one. He did not become a different man overnight. 68 years don't reverse in a lawyer's office. But he came to my bakery the week after, on his own, by cab, and he stood in the doorway with his hat in his tree-root hands, and he didn't know what to say, so I put him to work. I handed him an apron. I taught him, at 68, to fold egg whites without knocking the air out, the way my mother taught me, and he was clumsy and slow, and he cried a little into the bowl, and it was the first honest afternoon my father and I had ever spent together. He comes in most weeks now. He is teaching Emma to whittle little animals out of scrap wood at the back table while I work the front. He is not a perfect father. He never was. But he cut into the truth at last, and he did not look away, and for a man who had looked away his whole life, that was a braver thing than I ever expected of him. I have decided that late is not the same as never. I have decided to let him try, and Emma is 9 now. On her 9th birthday, I made her another castle, taller than the first, and no one shoved her face into it. She blew out her candles surrounded by people who love her, and my father sat beside her holding a little wooden fox he'd carved. And when she cut the first slice, clean and proud, I heard my mother in the sound of the knife. You never really know a cake until you cut it. I know ours now. I know what's hollow and what's solid, and what, against all the odds, is still sweet. I used to think the strongest thing a person could do was hold a family together by absorbing every blow. I was wrong. Sometimes the strongest thing is to pick up the knife and cut, and let everyone finally see